Hello and welcome to the channel. I will tell you interesting scary stories from Reddit and not only. Do not forget to support the author of the story. I will leave his credits in the description. I also hope for your support of my channel in the form of likes and comments. I really appreciate it. Get comfortable in your bed, put on your headphones, and turn off the lights. It's going to be a night of nightmares. We're starting. We sat there, drinks in hand, smelling the stale beer and listening to Mr. Newsom tell the story. The same one I'd heard at least half a dozen times staff meetings. No, none of us had ever even hiked before. The same one he trotted out on the quarterly earnings call. Why we kept going, particularly after Doug admitted he was lost, I don't know. The same one I'd heard him tell, in one form or another, at every happy hour I'd gone to since joining the team at Blueprint. So the we realized that we hadn't told anyone where we were headed. The story. He dined out on it, gotten free coffees from it, and even got out of a few hard deadlines by somehow working it into the conversation. Even as we sat around the campfire, hungry, lost, and more than a little afraid, we decided that assigning blame wasn't going to get home any faster. The gist was that his three buddies, back in their college days, didn't have any plans for winter break. It was Newsom, back when he was known to all simply as Mikey, his friend Doug Kennedy, and a guy that everyone just called Duke. Mikey and Doug were sitting in the day room watching some cable channel or another, and Duke walked by with one towel wrapped around his waist and another arranged on top of his head in a sloppy turban. He sauntered over them, slurping loudly on the can of Pabst in his hand, before inquiring what they were watching. It was at this point that it began to dawn on at least two of them just how grim things could get if they spent one more minute on campus. At almost the same time, Doug and I say, "Let's get out of here." So the story went that, with the vigor that only youth, mild drunkenness, and boredom can induce, they sprinted to their rooms and began packing. Doug thought that since it was less than a day's drive or so, that it'd be a criminal waste not to take a trip out there and hike the park. He'd told me once at the water cooler, after I'd casually mentioned that my wife and me had tried a short trek through a nature preserve. We had no idea what we were in for. There might have been a time I just took it as a quirk, just some OCD weirdness or narcissistic tick he did to feed his ego. But hell, he'd even managed to work it in when we all got our pink slips. Those of us that made it to the Christmas party that year had collectively let out a shallow breath of relief. We'd made it past an invisible marker, some signpost that marked us as having passed into some new and potentially safer territory. It was perhaps this odd cocktail of emotion that accounted for the exceptionally long line at the cash bar. The fact that it was a cash bar at our mandatory fun event probably tells you everything you need to know about the state of things at Blueprint. As you know, we have come through some rough times here at Blueprint. There have been challenges to the board of directors that have been with me since the very beginning. There have been some belt-tightening measures that have been painful for us all. And there are some members of our family that sadly had to look for other opportunities. The CEO paused there, his shoulders slumping forward. He looked over his assembled employees, the survivors, for this fiscal year, to make sure we understood the toll this had taken on him personally, and how bravely he'd faced it. With a sudden shift in mood, bordering on mania, the wiry man sprung back up to his full height with a snap and a Cheshire grin on his face that looked ready to burst. However, I am happy to announce that we have come through this storm and with the launch of our Be Better line of small business services, it looks to be smooth sailing ahead. Enjoy your bonuses, folks. With all your hard work and support, you've more than earned it. We were assured the money was already in our accounts, and that these slips of paper were simply part of a ritual that he enjoyed. The line to receive those blessed scraps of paper snaked around the various tables set up in the hall, and kept going out into the hallway, breaking down into a rough scrum at the front of the stage. Johnson, from payroll, emerged from the crowd, with an incredulous look plastered across his face and a hastily torn envelope held aloft in his right hand. As a reminder, a new voice boomed over the speakers. I'd seen him before, usually at meetings, carrying down some edict from senior management, or nominally contributing by agreeing with some point that had already been made. Please do not open your packets until you exit the ballroom. A security guard approached Johnson, who'd been showing the documents he had to everyone he possibly could, his voice rising over the growing din. "Oh, what are you going to do? Fire me again?" There was an almost audible pop as the cork forced its way from the neck of the bottle and the torrent poured forth. "What the hell is this? I've worked here for 6 years. You don't treat people like this." There were numerous variations on the same sentiment, all of it amounting to the same series of angry, indigent noises. The end result was the same. It was a purge. Most of us were out on our ears, while the men and women with the nannies and luxury cars would live to hire another group of us for when the need arose. Not surprisingly, the mixture of booze and rejection quickly transformed the gathered from a group of passing acquaintances, forced to sit through another mandatory fun event, to a unified and rather angry mob. Quite wisely, we were all politely but firmly asked to leave. A loose knot of us gathered at the front of the building before the flashing red and blue of police lights convinced us to depart. We filtered into a green brick place across the street, called ironically enough, the Trophy Room. The sudden shock of it all, keeping us from returning to our homes just yet. The volume of our voices and the animation of our gestures might suggest to some casual onlooker, as though this were an impromptu celebration, rather a wake for our jobs. Each of us were greeted with a rousing chorus. People that had never spoken before now talked in close, humid proximity, as though they were old friends. Rachel had initially said to forget about moderation for tonight. We were close enough that picking up the car in the morning wasn't going to be an issue, and if ever there was a reason for heavy drinking, this had to be a contender. However, as I ordered my second beer with whiskey chaser, I saw concern crinkle my wife's features. I pushed my beer aside. "Can I get a water, please?" Rachel gave me a look that made me feel positively heroic, but the moment lasted all of a second, as Johnson's hand snaked in between us, seizing my new glass of H2O. "Dude, you just got fired. Laid off." Half a dozen voices chimed in. "Whatever, he's got no paycheck coming in." He held the glass out towards no one in particular, and it was seized and rapidly carried off into the crowd. Somehow Johnson had been appointed the mayor of this encampment, of the unemployed and inebriated, and he declared, "What you need isn't water." Johnson then ordered 2 large double whiskeys and ushered us towards a table that he'd procured in the back. My wife gave me a slightly defeated shrug. I saw that Mr. Newsom had taken a seat at the table and had broken away from holding court to greet us with his wide smile. Paul Benson from accounting would tell me later that everyone had complaining about various aspects of their now former workplace. "HR man," Paul had said. They told me that someone had complained that I breathed too loudly, Wouldn't tell me who. What do you do with that? I won't miss the performance reviews, Sally said. Where do I see myself in the next 5 to 10 years? Well, not at this goddamn place as it turns out. The peanut shells, empty glasses, and long-held resentments were piling up faster than the waitstaff could clear them away. They had all been stunned when they heard a very familiar voice chime in. I get that things look dark now, but it's important that you all not give up, especially on yourselves. Newsom delivered this with a look of crushing sincerity and saccharine sympathy. And I know a little something about holding on, when everything in you is telling you to just lay down and give in. By the time Rachel and I arrived at the table, he was well into his story. We'd lost track of how long we'd been out there, but we knew it had been a couple of days since we'd seen any running water, and at least that long since our canteens had anything in them. I remember dragging my tongue along the roof of my mouth and feeling it rasp like sandpaper. I don't think I'd ever been that thirsty. He took a sip from the glass of ice water he had in front of him on the table and let out a satisfied sigh. Damn him. There was always a point where no matter how many times I'd heard it before, no matter how little I wanted to hear it even one more time, I was always drawn in. Not just hearing it, but reliving that moment of Mikey Newsom's life with him. We'd built a fire, but it wasn't doing much to keep the chill away. The wind was kicking up around us, blowing dust everywhere, and with everything being so damn dry, I thought all it would take was a single ember, and we'd be in the middle of a forest fire. We kept it going, though, because it was as cold as hell, and Doug said he remembered it would keep animals, predators, away. I don't know it was the exhaustion or the hunger, but while those flames were jumping all around, I couldn't help but watch the shadows jump right along with it. My mind, I guess I was trying to make sense out of them, but I started to think I could see something watching us from the trees. Right hand to God, when he said it, I felt the heat of the fire on my face, felt it failing to penetrate deep enough in my bones to stop the shakes. I could practically hear the wind as it whooped and howled like a hungry animal, calling out to its kin. The flames were dancing in the wind, struggling to provide a small circle of illumination, desperately trying to keep the dark of the forest at bay. In the inky murk that lay just beyond, I could feel a lurking, hungry presence, just a patch of darkness, a bit deeper than the night around it. As the flames jumped and threw sparks into the air, I thought I could see a dancing, shifting silhouette. It was at once a hulking, slump-shouldered monstrosity, a rail-thin spindle, limbed thing, and it was the darkness that surrounded it all at the same time. I reached under the table, trying to find my wife's hand, but I couldn't find it, my fingertips finding only empty, dry air. We were exhausted, hungry, thirsty, scared, and covered in so many bug bites. I didn't think we could feel any more defeated. Then Duke, he'd been looking down at his feet so long, I thought he'd fallen asleep like that. He speaks up. Doug and I just practically jumped out of our skins. It scared us so bad, and we missed what he said entirely. What? I say to Duke, who hadn't lifted his head at all, and he says, "What were you guys gonna do when you grew up?" The whole table was silent. Newsom slowly moved his gaze around the table, momentarily locking eyes with each of us. There was such an intensity to that look that when it fell upon me, I almost blurted out an answer, as though the question had been posed to me directly. Well, me and Doug, we don't say anything for a while. Duke had never been this guy. This was the kid that thought Uganda was a music festival. He was not prone to deep thinking of any kind. If he was having those kinds of notions running around his head, I think that's what brought it home more than anything else, that we were in deep trouble. We keep not saying anything for a while, just letting the idea that we might not be going home bounce around for a bit. And finally Duke says, I was going to teach, gym, go back to my hometown, get a job teaching, coach JV ball. I didn't even know he was an ed major, and I'd been friends with him for 2 years. He's just staring at us, and Doug says that he'd planned to go to law school, follow in his dad's footsteps. I heard his voice crack when he said it, and I knew that if I gave him a second more, he was going to start crying. Honestly, I couldn't handle it. So I jumped in and said not only was I planning to get an MBA, I was going to do it. Duke was going to be a teacher, Doug a lawyer, and I was going to make a killing in business. If we told ourselves that, if we believed that, then we were not going to curl up and just die out there in the middle of nowhere. He paused then, clearly overcome with the emotion of the moment. Then it happened. What? Rachel said next to me, and suddenly my hand found hers. I didn't know I'd still been trying that whole time. The Rangers threw a bucket of water over our fire. His face broke into a wide, earnest smile. And just like that, the story was over and we were back in the bar. Christmas decorations of tinsel and evergreen surrounding use rather than desolate forest. Newsom told us that the Rangers gave them water, practically swaddled them in blankets, and saved their lives. All I'm saying, guys, and I know it's a cliche, but it always darkest before the dawn. I swear I could still smell the lingering smoke and aerated ash from Newsom's campfire. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I may have had one too many of these. He motioned towards his pint of water, smiling with a self-satisfied grin, and headed towards the men's room. A deep silence followed his departure, many of us staring down into our drinks or the middle distance, until Johnson spoke, breaking the quiet like a loud church belch. Well, certainly won't miss hearing that again. The gathered exploded into riotous laughter. How many times? 20 times since I started at least. How many ways did he shoehorn that in? God, countless. I don't think he even got let go, Johnson said, bookending the conversation. It was that last one that caught my attention. Up until that point, I'd been quietly numb on the whole subject. Maybe it was a low-grade form of shock, or I'd had the right amount of alcohol in my system. But there really hadn't been any anger bubbling up in me. Finding out that Newsom would still be among the employed, come Monday morning, opened the floodgates, and I heard myself say, "Are you serious?" "Yeah. I don't think anyone from middle management up caught the axe today. They might later, but for right now." "Well, that's pure bullshit." "Honey, no. We get tossed out onto the street like $2 hookers, and he still feels like he's got the right to." "No, absolutely not." I stood, fully intending to go to bathroom and what? Ask him who the hell he thought he was, kick his ass? Rachel placed one hand on my wrist and I stopped. My anger and helplessness shook around in me, one awful feeling trying to gain dominance over the other. Standing there, I saw that I had everyone's attention. I've heard that story before." "We all have," Paul said. "Yeah, but I mean before I even met him. We went to the same college. He really lit up when he saw it on my resume." The small part of my mind that remained sober in these moments, the bit pushed so far to the back that it could control or prevent nothing, registered that I sound quite drunk. He tells me that he hadn't run into many other Trask alumni, and right away he starts telling me the story. I'm interviewing, for God's sake. Education was like the second bullet point on my resume at the time, and he tells me the whole thing from beginning to end. Never asked me about experience or goals. Zilch. When he got to the part about the Rangers, he just thanked me for my time, and I went home of not clue what had just happened. "John," my wife cautioned, "you're getting really loud and he's just in the bathroom." I looked at my wife very calmly and said in an even tone, "I don't give a damn." Then I shrugged in that way that only the belligerently drunk can achieve. And it's not even true anyway. "What isn't true?" Johnson asked. "His story," I practically bellowed. "Everybody at Trask has heard that one. 3 guys back in the 80s stayed behind over break and decided to go camping or hiking or some other shit. They get lost, and because the school is shut down and their families hadn't been expecting them, nobody goes looking until it's too late." "Too late?" asked Irv. I'd worked cubicles down from him for the better part of 2 years, and I'd never known what he did for the company. "Yeah," I said. "They all died out in Yellowstone somewhere." "How?" Sally asked. "I don't know. I heard the story about a dozen times or so, not as much as his version." My hand swept out towards the men's room, indicating Mr. Van Newsom's current location. This elicited a smattering of laughter, and it kept changing. One time, it was because they brought some coolers of sandwiches along, and a bear found them. Another kid told me that it had rained on them the whole time, and they froze to death. Another time, it was as simple as they died of thirst. "What?" Johnson asked. "Aren't there ponds and waterfalls and stuff?" "Yeah, but it happens all the time. People get going lost, panic. They basically work so hard trying to find a way out that they sweat all the water out of their system. If they aren't lucky enough to be near any clean water and drink the brown stuff, they get giardia." "What's giardia?" Someone, I think it was Johnson, asked. "You basically shy." "Johnny," my wife cautioned. I put my hands up and acquiesced. But the one I heard the most was that they'd built a fire, fell asleep and got roasted. "God damn," someone muttered from the crowd. "Point is, those poor bastards died, and Newsom trots it out as his boy's life adventure story every fucking chance he gets." "John, maybe it's time we go home?" Rachel asked, the keys to our car already in her hand. Johnson and a few of the others tried to protest, making the argument that I had nowhere to be the next day. The thought was sobering enough that I got a moment of clarity and nodded at my wife. Before I knew it, we were out into the mild chill of a Southern California December. Rachel hadn't had a drop since we left the party, so getting home was no issue. That night, as I lay in my bed, sleeping it off, I still dreamed of work. The blinds on the windows surrounding the open concept office were all drawn up, and the glare had been uncomfortably intense. A number of his co-workers were aimlessly standing around in that sort of way people do right after a car accident or a shooting. In the center of it all was a big round table. Johnson, Paul, and Sally were gathered around its edges. A number of glasses at various stages of consumption laid out in front of them. On top of the table sat 3 young men. They looked scruffy and tired and hungry. They had laid out around the fire they'd built in the center of the table. At the center sat Newsom. His mouth moved, but nothing came out of it. Everyone was silent, just quietly watching these miserable young men. Then one of them, a doughy-looking giant of a kid, spoke up. "What were you guys gonna do when you grew up?" The other 2 young men glanced at each other across their tabletop camp, exchanging a silent and concerned conversation. One of them, the leader, opened his mouth to speak, but he didn't say anything. He looked confused, and then seemed to struggle to breathe, tiny gasping sounds the only to escape him, until the smoke started to appear in wisps from between his teeth. then his ears and eyes. Rapidly, a column of gray smoke began to erupt from every orifice on his body. The other two joined in, filling the bright, airy space of my former workplace with a thick, ropey miasma. My former coworkers raced around in confusion, unable to find their way out. And then the flames came. Before I knew it, people were racing all around me, their hair burning off of them, their skin just melting away, and I could smell it. They threw their bodies against the doors, against the windows. Knuckles, elbows, and flailing limbs of all kinds battered against them, but no opening was made, and they simply continued to burn. I was lost in the smoke. I could feel it trickling and pouring its way into my lungs. I dropped to my knees, crawling forward with my hands out, trying to find some way to clean air, some way to stay alive. Something dropped onto my outstretched hand, and a world of pain seared into my flesh. I looked up and saw a burning figure, a man completely engulfed in flames, stand on it. I looked up into his wild and desperate eyes, even as the popped and ran down his face in a bubbling, gooey mess. Newsom bent down and clamping his fingers, disappearing as the conflagration ate them, around my shoulders. He drew me up to face him, and I don't know if it was the heat that radiated off his body or his grotesque appearance that made me turn away, but I still heard his words. "No, you have to believe me. They found us. They threw water over it. You have to believe me. They threw water over it, and they found us." The next day I woke up with perhaps the worst hangover I'd ever had. My skull felt like a cracked sack full of broken glass. The memories of the night's previous events hit me in waves. I drew my aching body from the bed slowly, and on wobbly legs, I made for the bathroom to get some ibuprofen. On the way there, I smelled coffee brewing, and eggs and bacon frying on the pan. We'd been trying to eat healthier, but it seemed like Rachel had decided that after last night, those were goals and concerns for another time. I left the bathroom door open and dry swallowed the pills from the medicine cabinet. When I turned to leave, I found my wife standing in the doorway, a huge mug of coffee in her hands. I've said it many times, but I truly love that woman. "You need to see this," she said, her tone as serious and grave as a cardiac arrest. She led me into the living room, the TV muted and tuned to NBC4. The screen was full of bright, angry, orange flames licking out a green brick building, sending black smoke high into the air. The camera pulled back and revealed a grim-faced reporter on the scene. "This is unbelievable," my wife said as she pressed the remote. A raging fire ignited by as yet undetermined causes ripped through a local institution, the trophy room, late last night, leaving at least a dozen people dead and many more injured. Witnesses say the building was almost instantly engulfed in flames. They cut to the owner of the place, a man I recognized as having been behind the bar that night. He said he simply couldn't understand it. They'd been inspected just 2 months ago. That was about 11 months ago, and as Christmas draws closer, I can't help but think back on it. The Trask newsletter arrived just last week, wrapping up the comings and goings of the alums from across this nation. In between requests for donations, listed among the many achievements was a section of those that we'd lost last year. Despite having occurred just prior to New Year, there was a little feature carved out from the rest, noting the strange and tragic passing of 3 men. Marion Duke Van Deen, class of 1982, beloved educator in his native Ismay, Montana, returned there after graduation and fulfilled his dream of becoming a junior varsity football coach. He died on a wintry road on the way back from a conference in Billings. A quick Google search revealed that he apparently had drifted into oncoming traffic. Local authorities suspected a fault with his vehicle as it had burst into flames. Mr. Van Deen had never married and left behind no children. Not so for his good friend, Doug Goff. Douglas Owen Goff, class of 1982. A successful lawyer that had settled in Providence, Rhode Island was known for his charitable work and was mourned by the community as a whole. His loss the previous December was even more keenly felt as his wife and 2 teenage sons had also been claimed by the house fire that had ended Mr. Goff's life. Michael Allen Newsom, class of 1982, died in a fire in Lyons, California. Mr. Newsom had gone into the financial services sector and made big waves in it prior to his untimely passing at a company function late last year. All were noted for their philanthropy, a gregarious love of their fellow man, and always ready with a joke, anecdote, or story for any occasion. The problem is that once you share it, a story is no longer yours. Maybe they were all found alive and well, but with each person that heard it or told it, details got lost or added. When Greg tells it, Doug falls off a cliff. When Stephanie heard it, Duke just wandered off into the woods one night without saying a word to the others. Never heard from again. Eventually, someone decides to outdo every version they've heard before. One where it all goes wrong. I tried telling the story for a while, the version where they made it back and lived to a ripe old age. Duke was still coaching. Doug Goff celebrated his 15th wedding anniversary, and Mr. Newsom was still presiding over board meetings and boring everyone to death. But I never sounded convincing, even to myself, and it doesn't matter how many times I close my eyes at night and hear Michael Newsom scream, "You have to believe me."